The snow is officially gone here in West Michigan. Hi, I'm Heidi from Garden Crossings, and it is mid-March right now, and it's just a beautiful sunny evening. So I thought I'd go ahead and explore the backyard and just see what the gardens are doing. A lot of times there's not a lot going on here in March, so we may find a few garden surprises or flowering surprises, and that's what I'm really hoping to find along the way. But we're also going to just look at the structure of a garden before it starts to wake up for the season. So let's go ahead and take a walk through my garden. So this past fall, we did some pretty extensive garden cleanup. The gardeners came through, and I really like to have everything cleaned up really well in the fall. That way in the spring, as the garden starts to wake up, there's not a lot that needs to be done. So our perennials were all trimmed back to the ground, maybe 2 inches off the ground in some cases. Our hardy hibiscus, we trimmed those back in the fall as well, although some people recommend not doing that. For us, it's just easier because that's when the time allows for it. One thing I will mention for those of you who have any of the hardy hibiscus or rose mallow in your garden, this is going to be the last plant that wakes up in the spring. Sometimes for us, we don't have our rose mallow showing any signs of life until about mid-May or so. It's even been as late as June in some situations if it's been a colder spring. You can see we got a little bit of trash going on, so this will have to get cleaned up. And oh, look at there. One of my ornament balls blew all the way here to the backyard, so I'll come back through and pick that up because I'm certainly going to want that for my winter porch pot for next year. So one thing we did do in the fall is we trimmed all of the shrubs. This here is the incredible hydrangea, and we took about 1/3 or so off the top of this, shaped it up a little bit. Incredible hydrangea is a hydrangea that blooms off of the new growth. So by trimming this plant, we really aren't worried about sacrificing any of the blooms for the season. But this way we could just get it kind of shaped up and looking really nice. One plant that did not get trimmed back was lavender. And you can see the little sprigs on there. What were the flowers last year. So this will just get a very light trim before the season begins. This is a limelight hydrangea tree, and actually I shouldn't even say tree, it's a limelight hydrangea bush. I do have a limelight hydrangea tree, or a standard, that we'll be seeing a little bit later on in the video. So this limelight hydrangea was probably about 8 foot tall. We took again about 1/3 off of the plant, and that's kind of a typical rule of thumb when you are trimming your shrubs, that you take about 1/3 off of the plant. Now we have in the past taken this plant all the way down deep into the middle of it to about 24 inches. So we did drastically a couple years ago trim this plant way back because it was just getting too tall, and we wanted to just really dial it down in its height. You can see a couple years ago it was trimmed back to about 3 years. That's what you're seeing here with these little trim marks. So every year we just kind of trim it back a little bit, or a lot of it, depending on how big or how small we want it to be for the next season. This here is a Weigela Wine and Roses, and this one too, we trimmed it in the fall. That is not recommended for most Weigela though, to be trimmed in the fall, because a lot of them do bloom off of the previous season's growth. So there is a good chance that we may not see this one bloom this year because of the time of year that it was trimmed, but it was getting so big and just kind of ratty looking. And I always like to say, if your plants are kind of big, overgrown, and ratty looking, sometimes you just have to trim them because they're going to continue to be ugly if you don't trim them. So you might sacrifice 1 year of flowers just to get your shrubs kind of dialed back to the desired size for your garden. So for those of you who have watched my summer garden tours, and if you are watching this for the first time, I recommend heading over to our YouTube channel and just perusing it and look at some of the summer garden tours. That's when you're going to see this garden full of so much life and so much color. This here is our clematis wall, and you can see that the clematis have all been removed off of that chicken wire fence, and We've got a few plants here that are about 12 inches, and then there's a few more that we get trimmed back even further to the ground. Now, when I plant clematis and trim clematis, I don't pay much attention to what prune group it's part of. I know a lot of people, are very cautious or particular about the prune group of their clematis because some bloom off of old growth, some bloom off of new growth, and some are more aggressive than others. But for me, I find that it's just most easy to trim them back in the fall to about 12 inches. And when they flower because they always do flower, even though I may be sacrificing some of those earlier blooms of the season. There's another hardy hibiscus right in here. And this is a very large one. I see a tag there that says Lilac Crush. I know that's not the case because this is a very old lilac. This is a very old hibiscus. So I think the tag just got put in there when the gardeners were cleaning this up. But look at that. Look at that big, huge chunk that is the hibiscus. So when this one does bloom in the summer, it is just a giant mass of beautiful dinner plate size blooms. This is a very old variety that's planted there. And to be honest, I don't even know what the variety is anymore because it's been since discontinued. This here is our proudberry bush. And this one we did trim back in the fall. It was getting very tall. Usually I do like to keep my proudberry going through the winter because there's beautiful pink berries that show up on this plant. But it was just getting a little bit unruly looking. So we did trim it back to about 24 inches or so. And we'll get to see, what it does next season. And it'll bloom or put its berries on for next fall. But it was just time that we had to take this plant and just really dial it in a ways. Back in this area of the garden, there's a lot of perennials, and you can see the remnants of the perennials that have been trimmed back. Sometimes I feel like this time of year is a good time of year to kind of evaluate your garden. Like looking at it like this without a whole lot of foliage, you can see where you have some bigger gaps. So those bigger gaps might lead for opportunity for you to plant up some more perennials. Now, obviously we know that the perennials and the shrubs do grow and do fill in the space. So for myself in this garden space here, it's a very mature garden, and I know I really don't have room to tuck anything in. Even though I do see some spaces in the ground that seem quite large, I do know that the plants that are planted in here will fill up all the space. But for those of you who have new gardens, those spaces could be opportunities for you to put some new plant varieties. This here is a very mature specimen of the Rhamnus fine line. So fine line typically should not be this tall. This is over 10 foot tall. This does lose its leaves in the winter, but the thing I like about this Rhamnus is that it's got such a narrow columnar habit to it. And even in the winter, with the foliage all gone, it still has a pretty dense mass to it that if you wanted to plant these as a hedgerow or a border, even with the foliage gone, it's going to give you some privacy from your neighbors if you plant enough of them in a row. Heading back and around here, we have a spirea, and the spirea was trimmed back to 18 inches, kind of shaped it up a little bit, got it in a nice mounding type habit. Behind it, we have the Invincible Spirit hydrangea, and that one too. We took a third off and just kind of sized it down a little bit because we know how much growth some of these plants can put on, even with a nice little trim to them. Heading in the back, we have the incredible hydrangea right here. And 2 years ago, I had the gardeners go through and kind of remove a lot of random branches. So with this plant, what would happen is those branches would touch the ground and basically they would start a new plant. So for example, let me go in here. That is the main plant in the middle where it's all dense and full. But if we look here on the outskirts of that main part of the plant, you'll see these branches kind of coming up. Some people would call them suckers, but actually they're not. It's where a branch laid on the ground, rooted itself, and created essentially a new branch or a new plant. So this hydrangea was getting so large a couple years ago that in this space here, there was all kind of branching going on. So I had them pull all that branching out, get the hydrangea dialed back into its original size. That way it kind of opened up this garden a little bit and kind of gave it a sense of being able to breathe because it wasn't so dense and full in this garden space. Making our way around, we're going to get into a lot of perennial beds. We're going to pop a picture up here of what this space looks like in the summertime. So we line the grass with sun pations, and we love how the sun pations perform in this garden. Because we have these large maple trees and pine trees, they do provide shade in this area, and by provide, that's not always a good thing. Behind, like the way we're looking right now, this is eastward facing. So the sun comes up in this direction, and then those trees, they create some shade until about 1 or so in the afternoon. Well, we had super petunias planted out here for many, many years, but we were noticing that as these trees got bigger, those super petunias just weren't doing as nice. So by switching it up and putting the sun pations in, they have done much better with the situation and the shade that these trees here were giving for early morning, in the early morning hours. On the back of the berm here, we planted some of the evergreen hollies. And the reason I did this many years ago is because I wanted the berries. For whatever reason, these are old varieties of hollies, and they don't berry up near as much as I was hoping. But it is nice to have these evergreens here just to kind of give a little bit of a backdrop to this garden space. On the back side of the berm, we have a creek or a crick, depends on where you live and how you say it. But it's a very shallow creek, only about 6 inches or so deep until it rains, and then it can get up to 3 to 4 foot deep. And this is a spring-fed creek, so it's always very, very chilly. When the kids were little, they'd hang out back here and play in it. And it's kind of peaceful back here to watch as the water runs through this back part of our property. I am noticing a little bit of life here on the daylilies. They're starting to sprout a little bit. So that's kind of encouraging to see some fresh new growth. I don't know if you can hear that or not, but there's a cardinal just chirping away. It's so pretty to be out here in the evening with the birds, especially. They're just as excited for spring as what we are, I think. So it's so fun to listen to their little chirping and the songs that they make. Not a lot going on here on the berm right now. Besides those daylilies, I'm not seeing a lot of green yet. A little bit of heuchera here. And this is what heuchera do in this garden space. This used to be a pretty decent area to grow heuchera, but once we put underground sprinkling in, it was too wet, and they didn't like the water that they were getting. So heuchera no longer do very well in this space in the garden. I have a few daffodil bulbs that are starting to sprout, so that will be pretty once we get those yellow flowers back here. That's one thing when I do plant this back hill is I like to take foliage into consideration, because when you're looking from the house, which is that far away, you really in the spring when things are waking up can see any of those plants that have that bright yellow foliage. It really pops, especially in these darker areas of the garden. So some of the plants I like to plant back in this area would be gold heart, bleeding heart. That one is that is always fantastic when that one emerges in the spring, as well as a lot of yellow or chartreuse green colored hostas. When those hostas poke through before the leaves are uncurled or unfurled, or however you want to say it, it's so pretty to see those bright chartreuse yellow pokes just coming through the ground. Now, this is one spot in the garden I was hoping that we would see some flowers, but doesn't look like quite yet. We do have more hellebore, so maybe we'll have some other places that are flowering. But this is hellebore or Lenten rose, and this is one of the first flowers to wake up in the garden. It's called Lenten rose because a lot of times you'll find that they flower around the season of Lent. This here is our hosta garden, and we'll put pictures up too of this hosta garden because right now you can see it's just a very blank and open palette. But in the summer, when this is just full of hostas, I love the beautiful patchwork of color that all of the various hosta leaves give to this space. This is about the only space in the garden that's what I would call a shade garden area, except for under our deck. So we definitely use this space very carefully and use it mostly just for hostas. Heading into the butterfly garden, we'll see if anything's going on in here. Probably, again, not much, but let's take a look at some of the shrubs and the structure that they give to this space. So here we have the Sonic Bloom Weigela. This is a Sonic Bloom Pink, and this plant was getting so big last year that I told the gardeners, go ahead and be aggressive with it, trim it back, and they have it trimmed to about 4 foot or so. It was really touching here on our firelight hydrangea, and I didn't want them to touch. I wanted them to be unique, separate plants. I know as the summer goes on, they're gonna grow and they're gonna touch one another, but I wanted to make for sure that I could create just a little bit of space between them so that they looked separate in the garden. As mentioned, this is the firelight hydrangea, and this one we do always trim about 1/3 off the top. This one is hydrangea that blooms on the new growth, so this one can be trimmed really at any point in the fall or in the spring, if that's when you prefer to get out and do some trimming on your plant. I love the color of firelight hydrangea. Such big, vibrant magenta blooms. One thing with hardy hydrangeas I should point out is a lot of times when you're seeing pictures of the hardy hydrangeas, you're seeing them when they're in their prime, bright, fiery red or pink color. But the flowers do start off as white, and as they age, they turn to the shades of pink. At least, I should say, for us here in Michigan. I know that those of you in the South maybe don't get the beautiful fall color like we do here in the cooler climate. Now, I like to leave garden clutter in my garden for the winter because when we've got the snow, or even right now, just seeing all these pokes of color just adds a little bit of life and obviously color to these garden spaces before these plants really start to wake up. Heading over here, we're going to take a look at some Bobo hydrangeas. This is a Bobo hydrangea, trimmed 1/3 off of it. It's about 3.5 foot tall. This is another one. A few years back, we drastically trimmed back. Let's go in and take a look here. So we trimmed it back to about 18 inches or so. You can see maybe some of the little trim marks in there. And they were getting bigger than what we wanted. And we're not afraid to trim shrubs around here. The more trimming you do on them, typically will create more branching, which in return gives you more flowers. But also too, sometimes you've got to go in there and you've got to give those shrubs a trim. They look cleaner, they look healthier if you go in and trim them back. Now, one shrub that did not get trimmed last fall is the Miss Molly butterfly bush. So for us here in Michigan, Miss Molly butterfly bush acts more like a perennial. So perennials, they die back to the ground every year, where shrubs don't die back to the ground. So for those of you in warmer climates, you probably don't do a lot of trimming on your butterfly bush because you're going to see new growth coming off of like these sticks that we're seeing here in front of us. But for us here in Michigan, most of our growth is going to come back from the base of the plant. So therefore, all of these sticks will just look dead. But I do leave them on for the winter because it does provide a little bit of protection to the plant by leaving these branches and sticks on here. So once we see where it starts sprouting from, we'll come in and go ahead and give it just a nice light trim. So we just wanted to take you for a quick walk through the garden. Obviously, I didn't hit every garden space right now, but I wanted to take a look to see if anything was awake out here, and just to show you what the garden looks like in an off season. Great time to get out there, find your holes, find places where you could maybe have an opportunity to plant a new plant. Also a great time to get out there and trim those shrubs if they are not spring blooming shrubs, because your spring blooming shrubs, if you trim them now, you're going to be sacrificing those flowers. But a good time to just get out in the garden, evaluate what's going on, and see what needs to be done as we await spring to finally arrive. It was fun to go through the garden this evening and just check out what is going on. Looking for little sprouts of life, which we didn't see many on this tour. But we just know that soon enough, spring will be right around the corner, and these gardens are going to be full of flowers and full of life, and just so much more coming to take you through the garden and show you as spring arrives. If you're new to our channel, we welcome you to subscribe. And for those of you who have been following along, Garden Crossings is a mail order company. We ship plants all over the United States. So you can head to our website, gardencrossings.com, to check out all of your favorite annual perennials and shrubs. Thanks for watching. I'm Heidi from Garden Crossings.